Both the world and the global financial market were taken aback by the results of the EU parliamentary elections held last week. The perception is that the so-called far right made big gains. Is that really true? Will the new political configuration in the European Parliament lead to meaningful change in European policies? What does it mean for the balance of power between the unipolar and the multipolar worlds? And what does it mean for the euro? Political pundits may be still arguing about the meaning of the results of the EU parliamentary elections. But what the financial market thinks about it leaves little room for debate. Since June 6, the euro is down against the dollar, sterling, and the Swiss franc. The Eurozone stock market has underperformed the world stock market by 4 percentage points. Yields on 10-year French government bonds have widened a whopping 20 basis points relative to yields on 10-year German government bonds. The market clearly got spooked. The question is whether the market is right. In this video, I will set out the 4 key facts as I see them and make some predictions at the end. In major EU countries where the populist right is in the government, either as the ruling party or as a coalition partner, the far right lost ground in the latest EU parliamentary elections. In Hungary, Viktor Orban's nationalist anti-immigration Fidesz party suffered its worst performance in the EU parliamentary elections in 20 years. It saw the share of the votes it received declining to 44% from 52% in 2019. In Finland, the Finns party, a right-wing anti-immigration party that had won 20% of the votes in the 2023 national elections and became the second biggest party in the country, picked up only 7.6% of the votes in the latest EU parliamentary elections. In the Netherlands, Party for Freedom, a right-wing anti-immigration party, which became the largest party in the country by winning 23.5% of the votes in the 2023 national elections, got just 17% of the votes in the latest EU parliamentary election. In Italy, the Brothers of Italy, a right-wing populist party that is the biggest party in the country, picked up 18 more seats in the latest EU parliamentary elections than in 2019. However, this came at the expense of the Lega, another right-wing populist party that lost 21 seats. In other words, the total share of the votes received by the Italian populist right fell compared to the last EU parliamentary elections. In Sweden, the Swedish Democrats, a right-wing anti-immigration party that is also the second largest party in the country, has a confidence and supply arrangement with the government. It got just 13.5% of the votes in the latest EU parliamentary elections, down from the 20% it got in the 2022 national elections. In major EU countries where the populist right is not in the government, meaning it is in the opposition, the performance of the populist right is mixed. In Spain, the anti-immigration Vox party won only 9.6% in the EU parliamentary elections, down from the 12.4% it won in last year's national elections. In Belgium, Vlaams Belang, an anti-immigration party that wants independence for Flanders, only managed to retain their 3 seats in the European Parliament, despite being widely expected to do much better. In Germany, AfD, the nationalist anti-immigration party, won the second most votes in the EU parliamentary elections, ahead of the Social Democrats. However, receiving just 16% of the votes. The important question on my mind is why it has not managed to capitalize more from the widespread voter dissatisfaction with the current coalition government. France and Austria are the only countries where we can say that the popular right did well or even very well. In Austria, the Freedom Party, a nationalist anti-immigration party, picked up 26% of the votes, the most of any party and up from 17% in 2019. In France, the National Rally, a nationalist anti-immigration party, won 31.4% of the votes in the latest EU parliamentary election. Reconquest, another populist party with a similar platform, picked up an additional 5.5% of the votes. France is the exception rather than the rule. I plan to discuss why in another video. Overall, the popular right made gains in the EU Parliament, but it is not clear that this will translate into major policy changes at the EU level. The populist right-wing parties generally falls into two major groupings in the EU Parliament. The European Conservatives and Reformist groups, known as the ECR, and the Identity and Democracy group, known as the ID. ECR includes the Brothers of Italy, the Polish Law and Justice Party, Vox, the Swedish Democrats, and the Finns Party. ID includes the National Rally, the Freedom Party of Austria, Lega, and Unbound. In the latest EU parliamentary elections, the ID picked up 9 seats, with the gains of the National Rally more than offsetting the loss by Lega. ECR picked up 4 seats. Combined, the two blocs now have 131 seats, that is 18% of the total 720 seats in the EU Parliament. Together with Germany's AfD and Hungary's Fidesz, the popular right now controls 156 seats, that is 22% of the total EU parliamentary seats. 22% will make the populist right the second biggest voting bloc after the center-right European People's Party, ahead of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. Will this increase the influence of the popular right at the European level? It is not very clear. Maybe not even concerning immigration policy. In April, the European Parliament passed a pact on asylum and migration to preempt the expected gains of the populist right. The new law allows for enhanced screening of irregular migrants at EU borders, but it also sets out basic accommodation standards across the EU and relieves the pressure on states at the bloc's physical frontiers by distributing migrants across the EU. Some populist right parties campaign to overturn the new law. However, they haven't got the numbers, especially given Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy is a proponent of the pact. The biggest problem of the populist right is that there are serious disagreements across the various national parties. For example, while France's National Rally and the German AfD want to end European support for Ukraine, the Brothers of Italy and the Polish Law and Justice Party are supporters of Zelensky and his war aims. While the AfD wants to push for greater fiscal discipline at the European level, the Brothers of Italy have an incentive to keep the EU money flowing into Italy. Europe has poured more than $200 billion in pandemic recovery funds into Italy since Meloni's victory in 2022. The populist right-wing parties will likely struggle to overcome the ideological differences within their camp to become a major positive force for change. The results of the French elections are far more important than those of the EU parliamentary elections. Following the poor showing by his party in the EU parliamentary elections, President Emmanuel Macron called a snap election to be held on June 30th and July 7th. The million-dollar question is how the populist right parties will do in the elections. More specifically, will they gain an outright majority? Some people see this election as France's Brexit vote, but Macron's gamble does not seem as reckless as they might appear. Macron is counting on France's 2-round electoral system for legislative elections to build him out. He's counting on history to repeat itself. Over the past 20 years, in the second round of French parliamentary elections, voters on the center-right and voters on the left have often joined forces to support more centrist candidates to stop the populist right candidates. Moreover, the fact that French parliamentary elections are decided locally across 577 constituencies means that parties with broad and evenly distributed support have the upper hand. In case you didn't know, the support for populist right parties tend to be more concentrated in specific regions. These peculiarities of the French electoral system mean for the popular right to have a real chance at winning, they will need to form alliances, especially with the center-right. The center-right Republican Party expelled its head on Wednesday for making the case of forming a pact with the populist right. However, I don't think the story is over. I think the National Rally will leave no stone unturned to bring at least some of the current Republican MPs around. The momentum is clearly with the National Rally. The latest poll suggests that it will win the most votes in the upcoming elections. But however, it will fall short of winning an outright majority. France will soon join Italy in making the populist right the biggest party in the country. This will be a milestone in European politics as the popular right goes mainstream in the second and the third biggest European country. However, my predictions is that Marine Le Pen and Giorgia Meloni will not be able to reconcile their differences for the increased representation of the populist right blocs that they lead in the European Parliament to bring about major policy changes at the European level. The biggest winner of the EU parliamentary elections is Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU Commission. With her European People's Party, the largest group in the European Parliament, gaining 13 seats last week, she's almost certain to get another 5 more years as the president of the EU Commission. Von der Leyen is the biggest China hawk in Brussels. My prediction is that her reappointment, as well as the anti-globalist orientation of most of the populist right-wing parties, will likely place additional strain on the souring China-EU relations. Earlier this week, the European Commission said it would impose additional duties up to 38.1% on imported Chinese electric cars from July 1st, as I've been predicting for the past month. I continue to think that a major trade war will break out between the G7 and China before the US elections. The latest poll said that no party will win a majority in the upcoming French elections. However, my prediction is that the populist right and the populist left will find enough common ground to drive key French policies. On foreign policy, my prediction is that this will make it very difficult for Macron to pay for his promise to send French troops to Ukraine. On economic policy, my prediction is that this will result in more government spending and bigger budget deficit. This could mean further spread widening between French and German government bonds, with the euro as a collateral damage. What happened to the Mexican peso after the Mexican elections 2 weeks ago is an example of what a jittery market could do.